Good evening. Dr. Farquhar McCrae was born in 1806 and died in 1850. The city of Troy was destroyed by an invading army of Greeks nearly 3,000 years earlier, around 1250 BC. The story I'm about to tell you will explain the connection between Farquhar McCrae and the burning of Troy. In the year 1586, the Italian artist Federico Barocci was commissioned by Francesco della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino, to create a painting as a gift for the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who was then based in the castle at Prague. This is a portrait of Duke Francesco, painted by Barocci a few years earlier. This is Emperor Rudolf II, who was better at promoting the arts and sciences than governing the eastern part of the empire. Barocci was asked to create something that was non-religious, yet would have special meaning for the emperor. He decided to paint a scene from the story of Troy. At the end of the Trojan War, Aeneas escaped from the burning city with his elderly father, his mother, and his young son, along with a large number of survivors of the war. It was a popular story that was depicted by many artists both before and after Barocci's time, with various degrees of expertise. After years of sailing around the Mediterranean looking for the best place to settle, the Trojans landed near the site of present-day Rome and eventually founded the Roman Republic. That was followed by the Roman Empire, and ultimately, under Charlemagne, became the Holy Roman Empire, of which Rudolf was the latest of a long line of rulers. And so the story of Troy had special significance for Rudolf. Barocci's painting was completed by 1589 and was sent on a 16-week overland journey to Rudolf, from Urbino to Prague. In the meantime, Barocci was asked to paint a second version of the picture as a gift for Cardinal Scipione Borghese in Rome. The second version was completed by 1598, nearly 10 years after the first. This painting is still in the Borghese Gallery in Rome, and it is from this second version that we have some idea of what the original 1589 painting would have looked like. The framed size of the picture is about 2.1 meters high by 2.7 meters wide. Here we have Aeneas carrying his father and accompanied by his mother and young son as they flee from the burning city of Troy. The architecture of the Trojan city was probably nothing like this. Barocci has chosen to use contemporary Roman Renaissance buildings to recreate what he imagined Troy might have looked like. The painting is signed and dated by Barocci as having been completed in 1598. In the meantime, in 1595, the Italian artist Agostino Karachi made an engraved copy of Barocci's painting. Possibly using Barocci's original working drawings or referring to the as yet incomplete 1598 version. Although they appear the same size here on the screen, the engraved picture is only about 40 centimeters high by 52 centimeters wide, compared to the painting, which is nearly 270 by 210 centimeters. In the days before photography, engraved and painted copies of popular paintings were widely produced for dissemination to art collectors. Today, we tend to diminish the value of so-called copies, but in fact they were highly valued and widely circulated. There are many copies of Karachi's engravings still in collections around the world. This one is in the University of Melbourne's rare prints collection. This is a 19th century copy, which was probably made by tracing the Karachi engraving. It's about the same size as the engraving and has been reversed. Between 1618 and 1648, the conflict known as the 30 Years' War spread across most of Europe. In 1648, Swedish troops sacked the Prague castle and took many of its treasures, including Barocci's painting, back to Sweden, where they became part of the collection of the Swedish monarchy. However, by 1654, Queen Christina had decided to abdicate and move to Rome to live. But instead of leaving the royal collection behind in Sweden, she sent much of it ahead to Rome, including Barocci's painting. When Christina died in 1689, much of her collection was acquired by Prince Odescalchi, the Duke of Bracciano, and it is possible that the burning of Troy was taken to the Duke's castle on the shores of Lake Bracciano, north of Rome. An inventory of the Duke's collection, made after his death, described the Barocci painting as having become very dark and in need of cleaning. In 1713, much of Christina's collection was purchased by the Duke of Orleans and taken back to Paris. However, towards the end of the 18th century, the advent of the French Revolution saw the Orleans collection sent to London for safekeeping, where it remained and was eventually split up and sold. By 1800, most of the Orleans collection had been sold to English collectors, and the remaining pieces, including Barocci's Burning of Troy, were offered for sale by the Peter Koch Auction House. Until recently, most art historians have believed the painting then passed into unknown hands and was lost after the 1800 auction. But how do we know that? Fortunately, copies of auction catalogues still exist, and many of them have handwritten annotations giving the names of the purchasers and the prices paid. In the case of the Burning of Troy, the selling price was noted as 13 guineas, but the name of the purchaser was not listed. Without going into the detail of the extensive detective work that I had to undertake, I discovered the Burning of Troy ended up in Edinburgh. In 1813, the Edinburgh picture dealer, Alexander Anderson, took 150 of his paintings to Glasgow to sell. Barocci's Burning of Troy was amongst Anderson's paintings. Anderson's sale catalogue has survived, but again, the subsequent purchaser's name was not recorded. This is the page describing the Burning of Troy in Alexander Anderson's 1813 sale catalogue. Anderson was asking 150 guineas for the painting and claimed that it had originally cost him 500 guineas, even though it was sold for a mere 13 guineas back in London 13 years earlier. But to find out what happened next, we must jump ahead 34 years and travel to the other side of the globe. In 1847, the Society for the Appreciation of the Fine Arts in Australia was formed in Sydney and held its first exhibition through June and July of that year. Residents of Sydney were invited to contribute works of art to the exhibition, and over 300 paintings were submitted. Many of the paintings were claimed by their owners to have been painted by European old masters, such as Rembrandt, Rubens, Van Dyck, and many others. It was clear to anybody who knew what genuine works by old masters looked like that the majority of these were second or third-rate copies. However, number 34 in the catalogue was described as Barocci's Aeneas and his family escaping from the burning of Troy. It was accompanied by a copy of the Karachi engraving, and the owner was listed as Dr. Farquhar McCrae, who provided an account of how he acquired these artworks. Farquhar McCrae included a note that told how the Barocci and Karachi had been purchased in Italy and brought to Scotland about 230 years ago by the representative of an ancient family, and that his descendants had considered the pieces as heirlooms and retained them for over 200 years. But then McRae says about 30 years ago they fell into the possession of my uncle, at whose death they became my property. McRae's story of how the Barocci had been purchased in Italy and brought to Scotland 230 years early is clearly incorrect, as we have just followed the trail of the 1589 painting through all of its owners right through to 1813. However, the second part of McRae's account is undoubtedly accurate. About 30 years ago they fell into the possession of my uncle, at whose death they became my property, and that places the acquisition by the uncle at around 1817, which is not long after Alexander Anderson's 1813 Glasgow sale. But which of McRae's uncles came to possess this painting? We need to investigate McRae's ancestry and family connections if we are to discover which uncle may have left the burning of Troy to his nephew. Farquhar McCrae was born in 1806. However, in 1815, facing severe financial difficulties, his father, William Gordon McRae, was posted to the Shetland Islands to work as a customs officer. His wife, Margaret Morrison, and the McRae children went to live at the Morrison family home at Ankerfield, overlooking the sea just outside Edinburgh. McRae was aged only 9 at the time, and we can imagine that the stories told by his uncles at Ankerfield were both embellished by the uncles and incorrectly remembered by the children over the following decades. This view of Ankerfield, the building on the left, was drawn by McRae's sister-in-law, Georgina Huntley-Gordon, in 1831. McRae's uncles on the Morrison side of the family were Sir Alexander Morrison, who was an eminent London physician, and John Morrison, an Edinburgh solicitor. Both uncles spent much time at Ankerfield. However, as Alexander did not die until 1866, the painting could not have been inherited from him. And that leaves us with John Morrison, who died in 1837. Or does it? Uncle John Morrison just happened to be the legal advisor to the Gordons of Gordon Castle, and McRae's older brother Andrew had married Georgiana Gordon in 1830, after persuasion from the Morrison family. Georgiana was the illegitimate but recognised daughter of George, the 5th Duke of Gordon. Andrew was encouraged to study law with the help of the Morrisons, and Farquhar was also given assistance through his education. And in 1836 he married his cousin, Agnes Morrison, the daughter of Uncle John Morrison, and his wife, Aunt Jane, whose maiden name was Farquhar. The McRaes, the Morrisons, the Gordons, the Buchanans, and the Farquhars, to mention just a few, were all related by marriage, and spent considerable time together both at Ankerfield near Edinburgh and at Gordon Castle. some distance further north. There were many among these relations who were probably regarded as uncles. This painting of Agnes Morrison, aged about 17, was painted by Georgina Gordon in 1830. It is now in the National Gallery of Australia. Georgiana also drew and painted portraits of other family members, such as this watercolour portrait of Farquhar McCrae, done in 1832. It is also in the National Gallery of Australia. Farquhar McCrae and Agnes married in Edinburgh in November 1836, and a very detailed marriage settlement was drawn up in anticipation of Agnes inheriting £6,000 after the death of her father, John Morrison. Farquhar was given very specific instructions on the advice of the Scottish Solicitor General, Sir Andrew Rutherford, as to how his wife's money should be invested. John Morrison died early in 1837, and in the same year it was decided that emigration to Australia was the best option for both Farquhar's health and for his brother Andrew's law business, both of which were not doing very well. In summary, the marriage settlement drawn up in November 1836 stated that Dr. McRae, who himself was a trustee, was entitled to a life interest conjointly with his wife in the sum of £6,000, which sum was to be enjoyed by them both jointly, or the survivor, if either, exclusive of the jus mariti and the curatorial power of Dr. McRae, and was not subject to his or her debts, but settled on the children in fee. The sum of £6,000 was accordingly placed in the trustee's hands at the death of Mr. Morrison as an alimentary fund. But what does all that mean? The jus mariti power was a provision of Scottish law that gave the husband control over a wife's heritage and any proceeds coming from it. The law, as it stood, said that the husband, as the administrator of the goods in communion, by virtue of his jus mariti, is entitled to dispose of them as he pleases, his right being more like that of an absolute proprietor than of a mere administrator. However, contrary to popular belief regarding 19th century marriages, many marriage settlements including clauses renouncing the husband's jus mariti. Alimentary fund, in Scots law, was the money that was meant to be used in meeting the obligations between parents and children, husbands and wives, grandparents and grandchildren, in respect of contributing to each other's maintenance. Such obligations were both natural and legal, and as the law put it, in consequence of the uncontrolled right of administration possessed by the husband, he is bound to aliment his wife according to his rank and station. The McRaes arrived at Melbourne in July 1839, and contrary to what Georgiana later wrote, it is probable that Farquhar McCrae intended to stay in Melbourne rather than go on to Sydney. Fellow Scottish immigrant Neil Black compared Sydney and Melbourne, and in 1839 decided that Melbourne was almost altogether a Scottish settlement, and that the people were, as far as he could judge, altogether Scotch in their habits and manners. Within a very short time of arriving in Melbourne, Farquhar McCrae began to invest his wife's money in accordance with the instructions given to him, keeping foremost in mind the long-term benefit to his wife and children. Again, contrary to the way some writers have described Farquhar's purchasing of land, he did not have pretensions to become one of the landed gentry, but to invest his wife's wisely. In Melbourne in 1839, the best way to invest money was to purchase land. By October 1839, Farquhar McCrae had purchased around 690 acres of land for just over £3,000, 4 miles from Melbourne at Moonee Ponds. As already stated, McRae's intention was not to become a gentleman farmer, as many have suggested, but to establish a long-term productive investment of his wife's inheritance. This is an 1858 plan of the moorland estate when it was finally offered for sale. Some background to his choice of moorland as the name of the property is needed. Farquhar McCrae's paternal grandfather, Alexander McRae, emigrated to Jamaica from Glasgow in 1763 at the age of 18. He worked there on an estate owned by William Harvey, whose daughter Mary he married in 1767. Farquhar McCrae's father, William Gordon McRae, was born in 1768. But Mary died in 1770, and Alexander McRae subsequently remarried and had 3 more children. In time, Alexander McRae became part owner of the sugar plantation known as moorland. With the benefit of slave labour, he acquired considerable wealth and eventually retired to Glasgow at the beginning of 1796, aged 51. But within months he had died. Many years later, it was claimed that William McRae, Farquhar's father, had been disinherited because he had supported anti-slavery causes, thus causing the McRae family to look to the support of the Morrisons. Whether this story is true or not, Farquhar McCrae had no hesitation in naming his newly acquired Port Phillip land after the Jamaican estate of his grandfather. Previous writers have made much of the financial difficulties faced by Farquhar McCrae during the Depression of the early and mid-1840s. However, almost everybody in Melbourne and across Australia in general suffered from the short-term financial depression of that period. McRae's situation was not unique, and he soon recovered any losses and retained most of the most important properties he had purchased. Although Melbourne had been described as altogether a Scottish town with Scottish habits and way of life, Melbourne was still a small town with small-town politics. Farquhar McCrae's tendency to defend his point of view through the local press was certainly not unique to him, but it may have caused difficulties for his relationships with others. By 1843, he began to investigate the benefits of moving to Sydney. It was a larger town, and his medical practice, he hoped, would do much better there than in Melbourne. In December 1843, Agnes McRae and the children travelled to Sydney and stayed for several months at the home of the Anglican Archbishop William Broughton at Woolloomooloo. Farquhar McCrae remained in Melbourne to settle a number of legal matters and eventually managed to arrange the lease of La Rose, the homestead, and moorland to Coiler Robertson. This lease arrangement would provide regular income from both rent and produce for many years to come. Farquhar McCrae eventually moved to Sydney in May 1844, hoping that the larger town would bring a more settled life and greater success for his medical practice, which he established in Castlereagh Street. Many writers have emphasised a subsequent quarrel McRae had with Dr. William Bland in 1846, yet none seem to have made anything of McRae's success in Sydney. By March 1846, Farquhar McCrae and his family moved to a three-storey house, one of five, in Lyons Terrace, overlooking Sydney's Hyde Park. Lyons Terrace was described as being Sydney's equivalent to London's Regent Square. McRae's neighbours at Lyons Terrace included the Chief Justice, Sir Alfred Stephen, Justice Roger Therry, a solicitor, Sir William Manning, another solicitor, and Barrister Richard Windeyer. The cost of purchasing one of their terraces was reported to be about £5,000 in the 1840s, although most who lived there appeared to be renting their houses from between £250 and £350 per year, still a substantial amount. Soon, like their wealthy neighbours, the McRaes employed a footman, a coachman, a cook, a governess, and at times a nurse. By the end of 1846, things were looking very good for Farquhar McCrae. On the 2nd of December 1846, 7 years after the McRae family left Edinburgh's port of Leith, the bark Fame left the same port bound for Sydney via Melbourne. The Fame carried few passengers but a considerable load of cargo. When the Fame arrived at Sydney on the 27th of April 1847, the Sydney Press reported that the cargo contained 5 cases of paintings for Dr. McRae. A week earlier, McRae had advised his patients that he would be spending most of each week recovering his health at South Head. He did not return to full-time work until the 10th of June. But within 2 days, he had joined the Society for the Appreciation of the Fine Arts, which was due to open its exhibition on the 22nd of June, just 12 days away, and he had announced his intention to exhibit 13 paintings. Apart from Federico Barocci's 1589 painting The Burning of Troy and Agostino Karachi's 1595 engraving of the same subject, Farquhar McCrae's submission to the exhibition included 11 other paintings, including a substantial portrait of his uncle, Rear Admiral Sir Arthur Farquhar. The inclusion of a portrait of Rear Admiral Sir Arthur Farquhar by the Scottish artist Sir John Watson Gordon is significant. Sir Arthur was the brother of Agnes Morrison's mother, Jane Farquhar. He was therefore the uncle of both Farquhar McCrae and his cousin wife, Agnes. Sir Arthur Farquhar and his namesake nephew, Farquhar McCrae, had been trustees of John Morrison's estate back in 1837. Uncle Sir Arthur Farquhar died in 1843. By 1845, his affairs had been settled, and in 1846, a significant collection of paintings was dispatched from Edinburgh to Farquhar McCrae in Sydney. It seems reasonable to assume that the paintings were inherited from Uncle Sir Arthur Farquhar. On the 17th of July 1848, Agnes McRae and their 5 children left Sydney headed for London and Scotland. They were going to stay with Agnes' older sister, Mary Morrison, who was now married to the Reverend James Buchanan. Her younger and unmarried sister, Amelia Morrison, also lived with the Buchanans. While in Scotland, it was decided that the three eldest children would remain in Scotland for their education. 3 years later, at the time of the next census in 1851, we find Jane McRae, aged 12, Margaret McRae, aged 11, living with the Buchanans in Edinburgh, and 10-year-old William McRae living over in Glasgow, attending the Blair Lodge School of the Reverend John Cunningham. The youngest McRae children, Farquhar Jr. and Mary Amelia, returned to Sydney with Agnes in February 1850. Unfortunately, during Agnes's absence, her husband's health had again taken a turn for the worse, and he was seriously unwell. Fearing the worst, in April 1850, Farquhar McCrae drew up his will. It was a simple statement that he left all his possessions to his wife, and gave instructions that his real estate was to be eventually sold for the benefit of his children when they turned 21. This was entirely in keeping with the marriage settlement that he had agreed to back in November 1836. Farquhar McCrae died at Lyons Terrace, Sydney, on the 20th of April 1850. He was aged 43. Within days of her husband's death, Agnes McRae made arrangements to vacate their house, sold nearly of the household furniture, and arranged for Sydney art dealer Jacob Clark to sell the Barocci and the Karachi artworks. This is Clark's advertisement. Farquhar McCrae's brother-in-law, David Thomas, travelled from Melbourne to Sydney a few days after Farquhar's death and remained there for 6 weeks to help Agnes sort out Farquhar's affairs. In the meantime, Farquhar McCrae's body was sent back to Melbourne with instructions for a funeral to depart from David Thomas's Bourke Street address on the 13th of May 1850. However, both Agnes and David Thomas remained in Sydney until the 1st of June. They did not attend his funeral. Having arranged affairs in Sydney, Agnes and the children then came to Melbourne, accompanied by 17 crates of furniture. It is likely they stayed with Dr. David Thomas in Bourke Street. However, a few months later, Agnes was with Georgiana at the house of Charles and Sophie Latrobe when news of Victoria's separation from New South Wales arrived on November the 11th. Meanwhile, back in Sydney, the raffle of Barocci's Burning of Troy had gone ahead, and the new owner was solicitor Hugh John Chambers, who had moved to Melbourne a few years earlier and brought the painting and the engraving down to Melbourne, where he arranged for them to be exhibited in the Melbourne Mechanics' Institute. As in Sydney, in Melbourne there was growing interest in the fine arts, and by 1853 the Victorian Society of Fine Arts was formed and held its first exhibition. Georgina McCrae submitted 13 drawings and watercolours to the exhibition, although Hugh Chambers did not submit either the Barocci or Karachi. However, as steps grew to establish a National Gallery of Victoria, another exhibition was held in 1861. On this occasion, Hugh Chambers submitted a number of his collection, including Barocci's Burning of Troy. A reporter from the Melbourne Herald visited the exhibition and made a comprehensive commentary on the paintings being exhibited. When he came to the burning of Troy, he wrote, "The burning of Troy is undoubtedly antique so far as appearance goes, and is so in fact, being by Baroccio. Time has dealt severely with it, but there is a good engraving of it, which forms a good key to its details." A week later, a second review was published, number 70, The Burning of Troy by Baroccio, which has become so black as to be almost unintelligible. It is a complete wreck of a painting. We might get some idea of what Barocci's painting had come to look like in 1861 by comparing it to this copy of Barocci's Burning of Troy by an unknown artist, which is currently in the collection of the Snite Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. You can see that the darkened condition of the painting makes the detail almost impossible to decipher, and we imagine that this is possibly the state of the Barocci painting by the time it had reached Melbourne. In April 1865, Hugh John Chambers was about to return to England and auctioned off most of his household furniture, including valuable oil paintings, engravings, and so on, including The Burning of Troy by Barocci in a massive gilt frame 9 feet by 7 feet, along with a framed line engraving of the year 1595. The new owner of the Barocci and Karachi was Edward James Hogg, a wealthy pastoralist, but he kept them for only 2 years before again advertising them for auction. His advertisement described the painting as a valuable oil painting, but made no mention of the Karachi engraving. The 1867 auction in Melbourne was the last public mention of Federico Barocci's Burning of Troy. It had been described as a complete wreck of a painting in 1861, and yet it was still regarded as valuable enough to purchase in 1865. The massive gilt frame, 6 feet by 7 feet, may have been seen by some as being more valuable than the painting itself, and we are left to wonder whether subsequent generations sent the darkened painting to the tip, not realizing what it was. Or did they store it in a garage or attic? And does it exist somewhere, forgotten and unrecognized? Agnes and the 2 youngest children left Melbourne on the Northumberland on the 19th of January 1851. 2 weeks later, bushfires raged across Victoria in what became known as Black Thursday. And around the same time, gold was announced. After nearly a 5-month journey around the tip of South America, they arrived back in London on the 18th of May 1851. Farquhar McCrae had been able to retain his moorland property after the economic turmoil of 1843. The rental income and later the sale proceeds of this property meant that Agnes and the children would be well provided for. When Mary Amelia Morrison McRae, the youngest daughter, turned 21 in 1865, the remaining Australian properties were sold and realised over £52,000. After returning to Scotland with the children, Agnes McRae at some point travelled down to London, possibly to visit her uncle, Sir Alexander Morrison. She was in London in 1854 when a cholera outbreak occurred, and she was one of 600 victims and died at Chelsea on the 17th of September 1854. She is buried in the family grave at St Cuthbert's graveyard in Edinburgh under her maiden name of Agnes Morrison. Farquhar McCrae Jr. married Elizabeth Hollins at Scarborough, Yorkshire on the 7th of December 1870. Their first daughter, Lily Morrison McRae, was born at Edinburgh in 1874. Upon her death in Edinburgh in November 1952, Lily McRae bequeathed the painting of Rear Admiral Sir Arthur Farquhar to the National Gallery of Scotland. Before she left Melbourne, Agnes McRae gave 2 paintings to her brother-in-law, Captain Alexander McRae, who had just been appointed Chief Postmaster at Port Phillip in January 1851. The paintings were the small watercolour of Sydney Harbour that she painted soon after arriving in Sydney in 1844, and a large oil portrait of herself painted by Georgina McCrae in Edinburgh in 1830. Both paintings were passed down through the family until they were auctioned by Sotheby's in 2004. They were both purchased by the National Gallery of Australia. And that is the story of Farquhar McCrae and the burning of Troy. Thank you.